Hey guys, this is Daniel Dr. D, and today I'm going to give you guys just my overall initial impressions listening to the JBL 4349 that Bob acquired. Got these on the used market for a reasonably good price. They're quite expensive new. I think they're around $8,500 new for the pair, and used market prices are typically half that what the retail is. And here they're obviously tucked in the corners a little bit far, so this is all because I told Bob just do some experimenting, because Bob normally uses open baffle speakers, not conventional cabinet speakers like you see here. And so there's going to be no sound demos in this video because Bob is still working with this speaker and setting it up correctly. And you can't just take a speaker and just put it in a room and expect great results right off the bat. You're going to have to do some positioning with it and experiments with it. And, you know, if you've watched all my previous videos, you'll know that the big open baffles and the black covers there are the speakers that have been pretty much in this room most of the time, and most of the demos are done with those speakers. I've thrown up some stats here for you guys on this speaker. They're 91 dB efficient. That's very close to the sidewall, so we had that pulled out during some experiments we did, by the way. But anyway, getting back, 91 dB efficient. Some of the actual measurements I've heard are down to something like 88 or 89 dB efficient. And that seems right to me, because I'm going to explain a little bit about that as we proceed. Two-way horn-loaded system, 12-inch woofer. Cabinets are about 80 pounds or so, and a little over 80 pounds. They're rated at 32 hertz on the low end on the bass, which is quite good for a reasonable size speaker. I would say this is good for a medium-sized room. This room here is about 16 feet wide, 30 feet long. And it's interesting going to a speaker like this after using an open baffle. And I'm going to go into some of that as we proceed. You can see the attenuators on here, which basically alter the upper mid-range and top end of the horn on this speaker. Now, there's a lot of information about these online. I'm not going to get too much into detail. My biggest interest in here is how do they sound? You know, how's the sound quality? Again, there's not going to be any sound demos here because Bob's still experimenting with this. And it's important to get those settings right before we do the videos, because I want to get the optimal performance first. And the Macintosh C22 is what we use for the preamp, and then we use the Pass Labs INT 25. Now, those components work fabulous with the open baffle, and the open baffles are, I don't know, about 97, 98 dB efficient, so it's very easy for these Class A integrated amp like the Pass Labs to run those, and it has very fast, good bass attack as well, and great sound. So I want to go into the listening impressions on here and tell you a little bit about what's going on here. The initial experience comparing them to the open baffle, these don't produce, nor would I expect them to produce, the sound stage that Bob's open baffles have. Those open baffles are very large. You can see them under the skirts there. And, you know, when you have two 18-inch drivers on an open baffle, they just have really great bass now. And Bob's made a lot of refinements to those open baffles over time. And as I said, you know, it's difficult to just take a different speaker, throw it in the room, and expect it to produce good results. So we had to move the couch forward because initially when we sat, we were normally about 15 feet back from the speakers, which is a bit of a distance. And I told Bob, I says, you know, I think we need to pull the couch up to about 8 feet away from the speakers and have a little bit more intimate experience. There's a bigger version of this same speaker, which they have like 15-inch woofers on them. In my opinion, those are definitely more ideal for this particular room, and these would be better for Bob's smaller living room at home rather than in this room. However, to compensate for that, it's just better to just move up closer to the speakers. And so we pulled the couch forward, pulled the speakers out a bit and away from the walls a bit. And I think Bob ended up with about 1.5 feet away from the back wall and off, away from the walls a bit as well. And The large subwoofer that you see here is an 18-inch. We didn't use that. We were just doing some tests with it. And then Bob eventually ended up with the KEF KC92, which is a great subwoofer. Worked and integrated very nicely with this. But overall, for initial experimenting, I told Bob, I said, let's just not use any subs. Let's just hear the speakers by themselves. So compared to the open baffle, they definitely have a smaller sound stage. And we just simply compensated for this by moving the seats up forward. Now, there's something really important that has to be mentioned here, and that is the stands that you see the speakers sitting on. You'll notice that they're tilted slightly up, these risers that they have. And what was interesting is that when we were seated about, 7 or 8 feet from the speakers, you could clearly hear that the top end horn was above the ear. It was pretty obvious to my ears. And I'm used to horns. I'm used to cabinet speakers. I can notice it right away. And I kind of lifted my head up about 6 or 7 inches and immediately could hear all this missing sparkle that was on the top. And I told Bob, I said, what I would probably do is either put something underneath the risers like shims and make the speakers more vertical, or I would raise the seat or something. That was something that Bob suggested. I thought that was a good idea. He was thinking about putting some wheels on the sofa. But either way, the way they are tilted is just definitely not. I mean, JBL, they're experts. They may have all their reasons for doing this, but I'm just telling you from my years listening to horn speakers that tilted risers in this particular setup, the way they are currently, isn't quite up to par, in my opinion, and needs to be tilted forward or vertical. And otherwise, you're just getting the top end cut off. And the further you are away from it, I see that being even more a problem, So I think that'll get resolved, and eventually we'll do some demos, and that'll be nice. Now, sound quality-wise, these speakers are surprisingly laid back sounding. They're not bright, they're not harsh or brittle. They're extremely well balanced. Balanced with regard to, does the top end sound forward or, back? Does the bass sound forward? Do instruments sound forward? It's very balanced. Everything is three-dimensional, but, even across the board. And I really like that. And obviously a ported speaker. Bass is very good, very impressive bass. Now, believe it or not as much bass as the 18-inch baffles that Bob did. And Bob did a really great job with his open baffles. He eventually really got those things tuned just right, and with the right amps and whatnot to power them and get the synergy working nice. Now, these are great rock speakers. If you're playing classic rock, they're fantastic. Better than my Heresies. And one of the things about the Klipsch Heresy is that it's a very fast speaker, particularly the Heresy 2. And I don't find that to be a good match for classic rock. Whereas these, they have kind of a warmer sound to them. And so I think it helps compensate for those kind of shrill recordings they did for some of the the bad recordings that they did for some of the classic rock. And Bob's found himself listening to classic rock albums for a couple hours, which is kind of unusual, And classic rock is just not the kind of music you play on open baffles. But when you go to a dynamic speaker like this, it can be a lot of fun, And what was really important to me was, how is jazz going to sound? And I was so pleasantly surprised and happy. Not really surprised. I mean, it's a horn speaker, so I do expect it to play jazz quite well. But it plays jazz fantastic. If you are a jazz listener and you love horns, you're going to love these speakers. They are excellent for jazz. And to me, that was just the most important thing, because 95% of all my listening is jazz. And from the 50s and 60s and 70s. And I think JBL really did a good job with this. They're not as colored as a Klipsch speaker like my Forte or a Heresy. And if you like that little bit more laid back, rolled off top end, I think these are wonderful, And they're going to fit that bill. I think they're a great speaker. I was very impressed with them. I told Bob my opinion. I felt it would be good if he would set these up at his house in the smaller room and have them, perpendicular to the length of the room. Here well, we changed our seating position, but he's basically seated in a position that's perpendicular to the walls, to the length of the room, which is good. And I think that would be an ideal setting for these speakers, a little bit closer up, and maybe at some point, if Bob wants, he can get the 15-inch models, a version of these. But overall, I'm really impressed with this speaker. I really like it a lot, and I think the potential to is there to really make it a great speaker. To really get it set up right, using the right amps. Now, something interesting that did happen that I think is very important to mention here, and that is, how much power are you going to put into these speakers to get them running? You can definitely tell that they're not efficient compared to the open baffles, and that is one of the things I found to be a drawback, which is kind of a bummer because Bob just got these new integrated Class A amps. However, that is in this big room. So the two choices are take the speakers, put them in the living room at home, which is a smaller room, or move the chair up closer, and that way you don't have to push the amp so far to get the same volume. But Bob really had to turn the volume up quite a bit to really get these things to sing. And, moving the seats up forward helped a bit with that. But again, I think amp choice is going to be crucial here to really get the most out of these speakers, because there's a big difference when you're using a horn speaker or speakers in general that doesn't have as much efficiency as the open baffles or the clip speakers that we use. And so it's a huge difference, and that's the thing I love about efficient speakers. You get so much flexibility as far as amp choices and power and whatnot. You don't have to worry about it as much. But I do feel strongly that the Class A amps that Bob has selected, like the Sugden and this Past Labs, will work perfect, just as long as it's in a smaller room or you're seated closer to it, so you're not having to push the amps so high. But overall, a great speaker, and we'll get back at you guys with more details once Bob and we get all the settings right, the subs matched real good, and we'll eventually do some demos for you guys. But for now, this is a very promising speaker, and I love it. All right, till next time, we'll be back at you soon.